Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our seminar for the JILV, for the Jewish Institute of Liberal Values, DEI, Disgraced. I am Mark Cohn, the National Program Coordinator for the JILV. Good evening to our viewers and to you, Dr. Lee Jussim, Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Rutgers University. I'm very grateful to welcome you to our webinar this evening. I know that you've been on JILV programs before, as the work that you are doing dovetails very well with our efforts to highlight where critical social justice, at a minimum, shuts down or rigidly controls discourse, but more maximally where it can manifest in all sorts of anti-Semitism, anti-critical thinking, anti-heterodoxy, anti-liberal thinking. To those of you who don't know Dr. Lee Jussim, as I mentioned, he is the Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Rutgers and a founding member of both the Academic Freedom Alliance and the Society for Open Inquiry in the Behavioral Sciences. In addition to being a renowned psychology researcher, Dr. Jussim is also an outspoken critic of cancel culture and the politicization of his discipline of social psychology and of academia writ large. For his efforts, as you know, Lee, you have been the target of cancellation attempts, and therefore I am grateful that we are going the opposite direction of canceling. We are platforming you on this night. So, in fact, it was the presumed publication, then cancellation, of this study that we're looking at tonight called Instructing Animosity, How DEI Pedagogy Produces the Hostile Attribution Bias. It was the cancellation of that study by Bloomberg and New York Times that we invited you and Joel Finkelstein to be a part of our program tonight. And just by way of update, Dr. Joel Finkelstein, who was indeed the principal on this research, will not be joining us tonight, though his work will be. And I'm so grateful, really, to both of you for your research and look forward to learning more. For our listeners tonight, the National Contagion Research Institute, where Joel and Lee and others serve, provides pioneering technology and research and analysis to identify and forecast cyber-social threats targeting individuals, organizations, and communities. That's from their mission statement. Now, what strikes me about the NCRI, Lee, is your, quote, effort to identify and forecast false narratives that create rifts of distrust that impact institutions, capital markets, public health, and safety.
Yeah.
Friends, what Joel and Lee and their team of dedicated analysts and their researchers, including the JILV's founding board chair, Dr. Pamela Paresky, have created in their most recent study is nothing if not fascinating, as it demonstrates and disgraces where DEI has the reverse impact of what presumably it ought to be doing in our world. In other words, if DEI is supposed to be about inclusion, it actually drives people more toward exclusion. It fosters one view rather than a diverse set of views. On the one hand, we could say, well, isn't that interesting? The only problem, or the myriad of subsequent problems, DEI has become and takes a role in shaping public policy, governmental contracts, school environments, and far more. DEI matters to us at the JILV because we are focusing our efforts in the K-12 setting, where, to quote our Director of Education and Communal Engagement, Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky, she wrote, DEI programs have supplanted what were once nuanced examinations of race, color, ethnicity, and culture with the simplistic binary language of oppressor and oppressed. It's an article that ran in Sapir Journal a couple of years ago. We'll give you the link for that. Lee, your central question, which is on page 2 of the study, and we'll drop a link to the study also. Your central question in this study was, do ideas and rhetoric foundational to many DEI trainings foster pluralistic inclusiveness, or do they exacerbate intergroup and interpersonal conflicts? Do they increase empathy and understanding, or increase hostility towards members of groups labeled as oppressors? Now, spoiler alert, if you've not read this yet, Again, you can go scan. By page 12, we read, while DEI initiatives typically affirm the laudable goals of combating bias and promoting inclusivity, an emerging body of research warns that these interventions may foster authoritarian mindsets, particularly when anti-oppressive narratives exist within an ideological and vindictive monoculture. So, with that background, welcome on this night. Thank you really for your research, and we're going to start with any reactions to that I just kind of laid out, but really how we got from page 2 to page 12.
Well, okay, all right. So yes, I do have some reactions to that.
Great.
While I'm on board with the core ideas there, but I think, I have a long track record of arguing that psychologists, really social psychologists in particular, psychologists more broadly, and many people in many academic fields have exaggerated their claims and conclusions based on research around which there is a wide swath of uncertainty, and that actually leaping to overdrawn conclusions on the basis of some preliminary set of studies is probably not usually a good idea. So with that context, that actually applies to my own work. First, let me say, I have been subject to actual cancellation attacks. A couple of years ago, I had 1,400 academics calling to retract an article that had of mine and several others that had been published that were critical of DEI. Now, in peer-reviewed publishing, there are very clear standards for when an article is justifiably retracted. So if you've made up the data, it should be retracted. If you claim to have IRB approval and you don't have IRB, this is an internal system for ensuring the ethical treatment of participants. And if you lie about that, the article should be retracted. These articles, mine and the others, had no data. They were commentaries, sort of perspective type pieces. So it was completely impossible for them to violate the conventional ethics that justify retraction. Then the mob failed. The articles were eventually published. That is a cancellation attack, though. We survived the attack, but that's an attack. I don't know if it's fair to call this a cancellation attack. It's absolutely true that the reporters at Bloomberg and New York Times met with us and seemed very interested in writing something up about our DEI report, and they decided not to do so. And I know many people have characterized it as like the mainstream media with a liberal bias suppressing the research. And that's possible, but I can't say I know that. That is, our research, like all social science research, has limitations and imperfections, some of which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay. And they may have simply exercised their professional journalistic judgment to say, this stuff really isn't ready for us to write up, or there's enough questions about it that, we don't want to we don't want to communicate to the general public about something that maybe is a little rough around the edges. So now I don't believe I believe a little bit of that. I don't believe most of it, but I don't think it's absurd that they might have made that kind of judgment. So that's the first part. And then second, I'm happy to talk about the details of the study, but of the studies, because we have 3 studies. But all 3, it's only 3 studies. As a reasonable rule of thumb, it usually takes years of research, replication attempts, scholarly critiques and rejoinders before some area is really, really well established. So, for example, in our studies, I'm going to talk about some of the things we did not do. we did not take the specific DEI intervention training materials used at a particular place at a particular time and evaluate how those affected people.
Okay.
So, for example, we did not identify. So I'm making this up as a hypothetical. I don't even know if my hypothetical has any truth to it at all, but this is an example of the kind of thing we did not do. We didn't take the DEI training materials used by the HR department of the city of Milwaukee. We didn't do that. So I have no idea whether the HR department of the city of Milwaukee actually even has DEI, but if it does, we don't know about it, and we didn't examine that. So an appropriate understanding of our stuff, that would be a limitation. We didn't take actual DEI training materials or intervention materials or education materials from a specific DEI program. And so this is important because it does stop, it means our researchers, the results of our studies stop a little bit short of a panoramic universal indictment of DEI. Now, maybe that's justified for other reasons, but that can't be justified by our studies because we only did a very sort of narrow, specific set of things. Now, on the other hand, our stuff was, given a choice, had we studied the DEI materials of the HR department of the city of Milwaukee, our stuff would have been justifiably dismissed as, this is one example, and what does this have to do with DEI anywhere else? Mm-hmm. What we actually did was we extracted text, quotes, in the first study from Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist and from D'Angelo's White Fragility. That kind of rhetoric and pedagogy is laced throughout DEI trainings to the extent that we could identify trainings. A lot of trainings are not publicly available. Some are, and actually our preliminary analysis in our report found that rhetoric is in fact laced through the publicly available materials. The second study was an anti-Islamophobia training, and we, again, extracted quotes from one of the major, maybe the most influential anti-Islamophobia activist organization in the country, and we administered that. And then in the third study, we examined anti-caste oppression, Hindu caste system oppression. In the Hindu system, there are different understandings and interpretations of what is going on in Hinduism. The most extreme version of an understanding of the caste system is this sort of rigid hierarchy that oppresses and stigmatizes people at the bottom of the hierarchy. That's sort of the most extreme version. So these materials, the biggest activist group in the anti-caste oppression space has all sorts of materials. Again, we quoted those materials and we had participants read through those materials. So these are not specific DEI interventions. They are the rhetoric and ideas that are common to many DEI interventions. And so we believe this actually makes our studies more generalizable, more relevant to what's going on in the world than had we studied the DEI, specific DEI training of the HR department of the city of Milwaukee.
So you take this study, you take these essays, right, which is just kind of the greatest hits of the language that's being used in different DEI structures, right? And then the control is people are going to read just a basic essay on corn production in the United States and its economic kind of impact.
Well, okay, so there are 3 studies. That is exactly what we did in 2 of the studies. Again, to run an experiment, you need at least 2 conditions. You need to randomly assign people to at least 2 conditions. Our studies were all 2-condition studies. And so one condition was the DEI training type material, the DEI pedagogy and rhetoric. And the other was an essay about growing corn, like a completely neutral essay having nothing to do with any of this. But in the third study, actually in the caste study, we decided to do a variation on that because this could be true for all 3 of the studies. We like having a completely neutral control, but one possibility that we wanted to examine in the third study was that simply making people think about hierarchies and roles and different racial, ethnic, and religious groups, that alone might increase certain kinds of prejudice or demonization or whatever. And so the control essay in the caste oppression study was not Cohn. It was a description of Hindu, and it was sort of like a multicultural description of Hindu practices and traditions from the standpoint of a scholar who understood those traditions. That's what we drew on. We actually drew on the sort of the scholarship to create the control essay. We drew on the scholarship about the two specifics were Jati and Varna. These are ideas from Hinduism that have to do with the different roles and contributions that people make to society. So this was a very neutral, historically accurate description of Hindu practices to be contrasted with the anti-caste oppression narrative of the DEI type manipulation.
Okay, so the people read these essays, right? Then they get a question. The question is this kind of neutral line of someone has applied to school, right? I'm going to read it because it's so short. A student applied to an elite East Coast university in fall of 2024. During the application process, he was interviewed by an admissions officer. Ultimately, the student's application was rejected. So, what happened next?
Well, okay. First, we did that in 2 of the 3 studies. So
I'm sorry. I keep going back.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We did it with the race DEI study and also in the caste oppression DEI study. We didn't do it in the Islamophobia study. We did something different. But because we're here, let's talk about those 2 studies. Right. So they read the scenario after having been exposed to either of the 2 essays. So in the anti-racism DEI study, they would have read either the quotes from Kendi and D'Angelo, which if I had my phone, I could, which were all about sort of pervasive white supremacy and the need to do something about it.
And I can grab it if you need it. I have it.
Yeah, if you have it, because I actually don't have it at my fingertips.
It
would be good to read like a sentence or 2 from that, just so the audience gets a feel.
So the essay that you're quoting for the Ibram Kendi one is. Do you want me to? This is the full.
It's like you don't need the whole paragraph.
I'll just give you the first couple of lines. People. Yeah, this is the Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo. White people raised in Western society are conditioned into a white supremacist worldview. Racism is the norm. It is not unusual. As a result, interaction with white people is at times so overwhelming, draining, and incomprehensible that it causes serious anguish for people of color. And then it goes on.
And it goes on like that for a whole paragraph. Okay, so so some people get that, and other people get this paragraph on how to grow corn. So the outcomes that we assessed were basically variations on perceptions of prejudice and various types of hostility and bias. So one question we asked after, so first they get one of the 2 essays, then they get this very short scenario about the student who applies to college and is rejected. And then we asked, how many microaggressions did the applicant experience? How much harm did the applicant experience? How biased was the admissions officer? And all of those were significantly higher when they got the D'Angelo Kendi rhetoric than when they got the essay on corn. So the DEI pedagogy is leading people to see in scare quotes, prejudice and harm that just didn't exist in the scenario that they read.
Right. That's what was so unbelievable to me. Is like this is a 2-line short narrative of somebody applies to school, they didn't get in. And all of a sudden, everyone's reading all these things into it. Were you? Yeah. I mean, and as someone who doesn't engage in research, I just read it. Were there things that surprised you in this, or things that you thought, well, I could have seen that coming? I mean, what?
Well, so we did the study because we suspected this was the first set of studies that I'm aware of.
And by the way,
all of this is demonization. Is people demonizing, in this case, the people in the scenario, demonizing, quote, oppressor groups or whatever it might be. And so we did the studies to see if we could capture that. And the one thing that is a little surprising is that a single paragraph produced these effects. That is surprising, even to me. I thought the hypothesis was basically true, but we would probably have to do different things to capture, we would need a stronger manipulation to more rigorously test the hypothesis and have a better hope of confirming it. That this weak manipulation confirmed it was really pretty striking.
Well, and there's real world implications on this, right? I mean, just this past week, I think we read an article in the Free Beacon Press that talked about in San Francisco, they were looking at San Francisco public schools that need to, they have budget cuts and are trying to figure out which schools to close and what to do and how to manage it. And it seems that some of the, the DEI or just that narrative or approach really begins to guide in unhealthy ways for schools and for people. So what do you do with this information? What does NCRI, or do you just create the research and then everyone now needs to work with it on their own?
Well, yeah. So I'm going to treat that question narrowly. What are we going to do with this?
Yeah, that's fine.
Actually, we have a series of follow-up studies planned to try and better both replicate the effects and better understand what's going on. So, for example, in the first study, in the anti-racism DEI, we used rhetoric from both Kendi and D'Angelo. Now, that means we don't know, was it Kendi's rhetoric? Was it D'Angelo's rhetoric? Was it the combination of the rhetoric? We don't really know. So a very simple follow-up is we're separating out, looking exclusively at the effect of Kendi's rhetoric versus Cohn, for example. In another study, the effect of D'Angelo's rhetoric compared to Cohn. So that's just one example. There's a slew of follow-ups that we're doing. However, I also interpret your what do we do about this somewhat more broadly than like, what are we doing right now about it? I mean, I think there's enough evidence here and in the real world, right? I mean, what this really, one of the criteria I use for evaluating whether a study or studies, especially preliminary studies, new studies on a new topic, are likely to be true or not, is whether you can see the findings manifested in the real world. Mm-hmm. Now, that's subjective. There's judgment in that. Mm-hmm. That's a quasi-scientific activity, because really, if you're good at making up stories, you can make up almost anything can relate to the real world. If you're trained in science, you realize, okay, well, you actually need evidence. It's not just like you need more than a mere persuasive narrative. But with the rise of cancel culture over the last 10 years or so, which may be receding to some degree now, but over the last 10 years, it has been ascendant. And often you had people being targeted for punishment or actually punished for things that are plausibly described as either delusions of racism or at best exaggerations and imputations of this sort of hostile attribution bias in really ambiguous situations. Just really ambiguous situations. And the world went nuts over them. And people have lost their jobs over things like this.
And that is the real world reality.
Yeah, that's the real world. Yeah.
So I want to turn, if I can, to some of the questions that have come in during our conversation thus far. We have a question here from Roz Shorenstein wrote, are any people doing comparable new research in deliberated ethnic studies, racialized, oppressed, oppressor ideology with respect to educational outcomes? That was that deliberated ethnic studies, which is a big piece of what we're working on, and we're paying attention to that in California in particular, but the general topic. The liberal ethnic studies proponents always cite studies about improved outcomes in minority students. The results of these old studies have been discredited. So what do you know about that in terms of paying attention to liberal ethnic studies and its impact?
There's not a lot of empirical research that has emerged from any of the studies programs, which is different than saying there's none. The question refers to an earlier discredited study. I think that's a fair statement. I don't know of lots of research documenting this, so documenting anything on this, because it's most, as far as I can tell, it's mostly a political activist effort. It's not an empirical scientific effort, and so I mean, in some corners of the studies world, the kind of empirical quantitative research that I and lots of other people do is itself the height of white supremacy, and it reflects the colonization of academic fields by Eurocentric and white supremacist discourses that serves to erase the experiences of minorities. Like, that's the rhetoric that's emerging from this. So if that's what you think, why would you conduct what I would describe as a serious quantitative analysis of anything?
Mm-hmm. Right. The ideology defeats the whole point of even doing the study. And that's this was a question that came from David Cohen. He wrote, the published study shows the percentage increase in how often people find discrimination where it didn't exist, but doesn't tell us the actual magnitude. In other words, if you increase a very rare event by 34%, it is still rare. Can you share the magnitude of the increase compared to the total size of the sample, or otherwise give us a sense of the magnitude?
Yeah. That'll take me I don't have that.
That's a good detailed question for in the research.
Yeah. Well, so this was a very preliminary report, and we purposely kept it simple, so that relatively simple compared to throwing in lots of statistics and p-values and effect sizes and regression coefficients and all that. We purposely left it out because your lay intelligent reader is going to get boggled by most of that. So here we go. Let's go here and go here.
That's one of those lay readers. Thank you. Did a nice read.
Yeah, let's go right to the microaggression. This is really a clear one. So, in the for the anti-racism one, the what is it, 152? It's about a little over 400 participants, and about 150 or so said nobody committed any microaggressions. So that's sort of consistent with the tone of the question. Lots of people were saying they didn't see any microaggressions.
Right.
But as you move up the scale, the scale was, there were 1 or 2, 3 or 4, 5 or 6, 7 or more. Only people who got the Kendi D'Angelo essay said there were 7 or more. Now, that was only 7 people out of these 400, but there was no one in the Cohn essay who said that.
Okay.
There were twice as many people, it was 12 versus 6, who got the extreme egalitarian essay who said there were 5 or 6. And it sort of goes on like this. So once you got past 0, there were consistently more, depending on the level, between 5 and about 20 more people saying that they saw this amount of microaggressions when they got the essay, the DEI essay. So the effect sizes are not gigantic, but they're not trivial either.
Indeed. Do you teach this material to your students at Rutgers? How does this information get disseminated, other than when Bloomberg and New York Times decide they're not going to run an article and the National Review suddenly puts it out, and so now we're reading about it. How do you get this information out into the professional field and to students? And then what's been the feedback, or what are you hearing from colleagues?
Well, so there's students and there's students.
Okay.
And by that I mean there are the students who work with me in my lab. There are graduate students versus undergraduate students. for students in psychology versus not in psychology. I don't know that I would teach this in an undergraduate class, at least not in an introductory undergraduate class.
Mm-hmm.
If I was teaching an advanced seminar to undergrads, or perhaps a graduate seminar, then I would go through this stuff, because you really need a good understanding of experimental methodology, how that links to causal inferences, a little bit of an understanding of prejudice and attributions, and you kind of need that. I would feel more comfortable teaching it to people who had that background. So I'm not teaching this year. In fact, over the last 12 years, I spent 7 chairing 2 different departments. And one side benefit of that is Rutgers has a very good system. When you chair a department, they give you a number of course releases. I mean, you have to teach less than usual.
Because you have administration.
Recover from all this administrative nonsense, get back on your sort of scholarly track, and then, so I'll be teaching again next year, but I'm not teaching this year. So I don't really have to face that question other than within my lab, and within my lab, it's fine.
Sure, because you're working with people who are on the team.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Well, what do you do? One of the questions we got, someone, Holly Rudnick-Kurtzberg wrote, she said, how do you control for prior exposure to DEI in the participants and pre-existing biases, which another person, Rochelle Chester, chimed in here and says, because, I mean, after all, when you think about how much anti-racist children's picture books there are, or what people are reading before they would even get to answering. Yeah. How do you control for that? Or, I mean,
well, the simple example to that is the basics of experimental methodology. So I hope I don't get too wonky or nerdy here, but
you're okay.
If you randomly assign people to groups, basically with 2 groups, it's the equivalent of a coin flip. So if it heads, you go into the Kendi D'Angelo group. If it's tails, you go into the Corn group. And you do that for all 400 people. We would use a random number generator or some online computer system, but that's basically do the same thing. By randomly assigning people to condition, you effectively, the point of random assignment is to minimize all those differences. That's the point. Mm-hmm. So there is no reason to believe that all the people who've been through DEI training, or most of the people who've been through DEI trainings, end up in one condition than another. The probability of that is incredibly low. I mean, let's say with 400 people, 200 have been through a DEI training. Let's just say that. Can you imagine a balanced coin coming up heads 180 out of 200 times? Like, that probability is effectively 0. So that's why random assignment is the great equalizer. It inherently controls for all that. The narrow answer to the narrow question is, we didn't, other than random assignment, we didn't do anything. We didn't ask people if they'd been through trainings. We didn't use that as a statistical control. So the answer really is random assignment. Now, that doesn't mean it's unimportant. And who knows whether we can't address the question of whether people who've been through a training responded differently than those who haven't, because we didn't assess that.
Mm-hmm. We got a question. Jack Berger wrote a question here. Can you discuss the problem with the term equity being equated to equality of opportunity?
Okay, so that's a very different kind of question that sort of, you could make the case that it's relevant, sort of the general issue of relevance to our studies, but we didn't really study that. It is funny, though. I was just fooling around, really, within the last hour on ChatGPT, and I asked it that. And ChatGPT tends to drift wokish, but it actually gave some pretty good answers. So I'm just going to summarize. Yeah.
My really was it gave a good answer to that's because, so when we think about this, our discussion tonight was really to look at the study and this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Obviously that's, and Jack, where you're pulling in that question is exactly an important point of where I think for a lot of us, we would say, well, who wouldn't want it? We want diversity. That feels like a good thing. And so too, when we think about equality, or equality of maybe access or opportunity, this feels like a good thing. So too, inclusive, like we want to include things, but that's not how it plays out. So what did you learn from Dr. GPT?
Yeah, so here's what it says. Here's the core difference. I asked him, what's the difference between equity and equality? Equality is the same treatment for everyone. Equity is fair treatment that accounts for individual needs and circumstances, aiming to achieve fairness in outcomes. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not sure, again, this is ChatGPT. Its description of equity, this is all very fuzzy because equality can also refer to equality of outcomes.
Right.
And in practice, as far as I can tell, equity is often presumed to mean equality or flip the script in outcomes. So equality is, group equality. So, if there are more, which there are, I'm inventing the number, but if 75 or 80% of STEM fields are men, then that's inequitable. And equity won't be achieved until it's at least half women. At the point that it flips, if it's 60, 70, 80% women, that's fine. The people who care about equity won't care about that. And the reason we know that is because women dominate academics from high school through college. That women get more high school degrees, they get more college degrees, they get more advanced degrees, they do better in in just about every field academically, and there's no social justice outcry about how the education system is systematically biased against men. Now, I don't know that it is systematically biased against men. So I'm not saying, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm not saying that it is, but if, it seems to me logically, if a gap here means bias, then a gap there means bias. You can't have it both ways, that some gaps mean bias, but gaps that I'm good with don't mean bias. Like, I don't see how that works. But it clearly does work for, many on the progressive academic left. Yes,
you could say that about how DEI gets applied and where it gets applied, where it doesn't. There's a question here from, and I apologize if I mispronounce anybody's name this evening. Sarita Turk wrote, she said, as an historian and teacher of history at a Jewish day school, I'd like clarification, and I apologize if I missed this. Does your study suggest the study of historical facts of the American South and the civil rights movement leads to seeing the world in more of the oppressed-oppressor binary?
We didn't study that, so the simple answer is no. Now, whether it does or does not, that's actually an interesting question, because history is an interesting thing, right? It's like big and complex, and there are lots of things you might select and choose from. I would not be surprised. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say I'd predict it. If you immersed people in the bona fide historical evils of American white supremacy, with slavery, Jim Crow, lynchings, like the whole thing, and that's all you did. You didn't go into the American Revolution. You didn't go into the Constitutional Convention. You didn't go into the Civil War, where the North went to war, and God knows how many people died in order to end slavery. If you didn't go into the 1960s civil rights movement and the subsequent legislation passed by almost exclusively white legislators, if you didn't go into any of that, and all you did was the bona fide history of oppression in the United States, you might get the kind of effects that I wouldn't be surprised if you got the kind of effects we got.
Right. I think, having grown up I grew up in California. I'm 56, just to date me. So grew up in California. We learned about slavery. We learned about civil rights. We learned about what happened to Native Americans, and certainly California. There's a significant story there. We learned about the Spanish missionaries who came and what happened to them. That's very different and learning that story, because we also learned, of course, 1776 and 1787 and all the significant things that happened in those years. That's very different than coming along and studying the language that comes up from Kendi and D'Angelo and others. And somehow I was able to grow up and have that background and understand the good, the bad, what has been named in other circles as the oscillating narratives of a people, where we have the good, we have the bad, we have different things, and how that there's a difference in the language of what's been introduced really over the last 5-10-ish years, than understanding history and trying to say, okay, these are the stories. Now let's try to sift through that. Just a couple of the comments I wanted to skim through real quick. Lee, you're being put on the spot to be a government policy advisor right now, so get yourself ready. Paul Bardak writes, if there are governmental policymakers in the audience, especially those who care viscerally about helping those confronting historic discrimination, what would you advise them? Right? What do you advise? Because we want to address discrimination, what's happened historically. So how?
Well, so I would advise that on this particular issue, I mean, it's going to vary from context to context, but if we're talking college admissions, graduate admissions, employment, hiring, I would say at that point, you want to focus like a laser on merit. By focusing on merit, you eliminate if you successfully focus on merit, you eliminate all biases at the point of that evaluation. Now, the question was about historical discrimination and the effect of basically historical oppression. That's a different and more difficult question. So I personally, now I'm talking for values, not empirical science. I think it's a mistake to punish people for crimes they did not commit. So, if New Jersey ever has a referendum on affirmative action, I will vote against it. Now, by affirmative action, I mean preferential selection. There are actually other kinds of affirmative action, like taking proactive steps to engage in the outreach necessary to bring people in on whatever it is, whether it's applying for a job or college or whatever it might be. If people have inadequate preparation, again, for whatever the path to success is going to college, going to graduate school, professional school, getting a job, well, then the relevant intervention is to provide the preparation necessary to bring them up to snuff so that they can then compete on a straight up merit basis.
Right. This gets to the idea of the equality of opportunity, that we want to give people, no matter what has happened historically, we want to give people the tools. And then, yes, at a certain point, there's personal responsibility and what we can then do with it, and merit and what we can do.
Just along these lines, very concretely, I don't know how much people are following this, but the University of Michigan has been sort of a hotbed of these controversies. And it had a very large, very expensive DEI program that there was really a great expose in the New York Times about that. At least according to that expose, it seems like it was an unmitigated disaster. The regents recently voted to ban the use of DEI statements in faculty hiring and promotion. So they were using DEI statements. So when you apply for a job, in a DEI statement, you're supposed to communicate your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Many people believe that functioned as a political litmus test and also as compelled speech. That is, if you want, either you're censored, you know what, I'm not committed to DEI, so I can't apply for this job, you're censored out, or you lie, right? I mean, there's a great essay by Václav Havel, what the hell is it? Oh, I'm blanking on the name of it. And one of the things he talks about in it is a greengrocer, in behind the Iron Curtain, who, in the window of his store, there's a banner saying "Workers of the World Unite." And he says, well, why is that there? Is this because this is expressing his deep commitment to a bright communist future? Or is he just sort of going along because he has to go along and, doesn't want to have any trouble and, and is signaling to the powers that be that he's not going to give them any trouble? That's one interpretation of DEI statements. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Michigan banned them. The regents banned them. They also recently announced that they are going to be dramatically expanding the support they provide to low-income students to be able to attend Michigan, which is a state school, which is a very expensive state school. And following on that, as I understand it, this is not yet a commitment, but there was some discourse around the idea that they will get that money by closing much of the DEI bureaucracy. Now, I think that's an answer to the question. Right? If you're you're reasonably you're high achieving enough to warrant attending Michigan, you can't afford it. To provide the money for those students rather than DEI bureaucrats seems to me a very constructive use of that money and to answer that question. And on top of that, there are income inequalities based on race and religion and nationality all throughout the country. Black people are, on average, less wealthy, have lower incomes than do white people. Therefore, they are likely to disproportionately be the beneficiaries of such a program. So without race-based affirmative action, right, which is pretty clear that that's illegal. I mean, if you just read civil rights law, you cannot discriminate on the basis of race. Right. And then you also have the Students for Fair Admissions decision. It's pretty clear the Supreme Court is going down. You cannot discriminate on the basis of race. But there's no law saying you can't discriminate on the basis of income. It's completely illegal to discriminate on the basis of income. And you will be channeling whatever resources you have as a college and academic institution to the students who actually need it and would most benefit from it. I'm totally on board with that.
I have heard this from more than one academic and more than one board member who is on a board for a major university to say, why not use this money instead of for this DEI department? Give it to the kids who really could use it.
Absolutely.
It's going to help the statistics and everything all the way along. And these are kids who have to.
I had massive finance. I had no money. Like my parents didn't send me to school. I worked as a security guard and a laundromat attendant, and I got really large amounts of financial aid. I would not be where I am now if it wasn't for programs like that. It's very powerfully salient to me how effective they can be.
And that feels like a very good potential outcome. And I did see that. And I appreciate you earlier when you were saying, when Bloomberg, you were very generous in your read as to why Bloomberg and New York Times, and we don't know. And I think that's a really important point to say before we start concocting all kinds of theories and about this and the other. And there are reasons to have some of those theories. I'm just going to say,
absolutely.
But it was a generous read. And it was an important thing to say, to applaud when the New York Times or whoever is going to bring in an article to say, hey, look at what happened at Michigan and how they are changing course and they need to change course.
Yeah.
And hopefully others will too. Is the essay that you were mentioning by Hoffel, The Power of the Powerless?
Yeah, The Power of the Powerless. Yeah, that's yes. Absolutely.
Thank you, Marcy Goldstein, our academic affairs director.
Yeah, it's a great essay.
With that. Okay,
yeah.
Great. Friends, if we just watching the time, because we're going to start to close off in the not too distant future. If you want to throw another chat in there, Allison Rosen asks, do you know of any methods of countering the problematic biases you induced?
Well, we did not try to undo them. So I don't really, I can't give you an empirical answer to that. Although I suspect that exposure to this kind of discussion would undo it, actually. An exposure to a discussion of the overreach and I'm going to call them unannounced negative side effects of DEI rhetoric. Like usually people talk about unintended side effects. Mm-hmm. I do not at all know that demonizing oppressor groups is not intentional on the part of those promoting at least the kinds of DEI rhetoric that we study. That demonization rhetoric kind of seems baked into the core ideas. But certainly they don't announce it as, well, we're going to demonize people in the name of inclusion. Like, no one says that. So, but I do suspect that this sort of pluralistic, the sort of pluralistic, humanistic undertones of this conversation, that yes, you can treat people on the basis of merit. Yes, there are bona fide needs out there. Yes, it's reasonable to do something about this. We're all Americans. We're all in this together. And it does behoove us to do something about people who maybe have not been given the fairest shake in the world. Mm-hmm. Like I suspect that kind of thing would undo it, but I don't know that. We haven't studied it yet. That's actually a great suggestion for follow-up study, which I now have in my back pocket, so thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Great. I want to read Miles Rind wrote a comment here. It's a very good point there about the meaning of equity as used by defenders of DEI. One, it presupposes a specific classification scheme according to gender, race, and so on. Two, it does not concern distribution among individuals, but among groups as defined by aforementioned scheme. Three, it scores or weights groups according to their supposed privilege. And four, what is called equity is an equal or greater distribution of social benefits within the groups weighted as unprivileged.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct.
It's an important point. Thank you for that, Miles. Great. If there are any other points that you wanted to make, otherwise I just have a quick close. Or if anyone has any other question to drop in our chat. Lee, anything else you want to say, or I'll close this off for the night?
Yeah, I'm good.
Great. So, friends, thank you all for joining us tonight. Lee, what a pleasure to have you here.
It's been
we really, we just can't thank you enough for your work and taking time to help with our programming and learning at the JILV. If you are not already a subscriber to our newsletter, or if you're looking for important background material on topics that need further explanation, or if you would like to contribute to our work with an end-of-the-year donation, just go visit us at www.jilv.org. As we look toward the new year, we're working harder and more concentrated on K-12 education in New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia. But the lessons we're learning and the work we're doing to assist parents and educators apply nationwide, these topics that we hit on tonight and elsewhere. If you want to learn more, reach out, please. Do check out our website. We have a great trackers. It's called K-12 Trackers. Substack, K1, it's right there on your screen. You can learn more. Lee, it'll just send shivers up your spine seeing some of what's going on as very much an impact of DEI and other things. So in the meantime, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. And Lee, thank you to you and to Joel and others at NCRI for the work that you're doing. And wish you a good night.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Take good care now. Bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.